Hi everyone, my name is Cleus Glory Young. Many of you are aware of me being the super, and I mean super proud author of the Airport Adventure Live Safely bookazine. I can't begin to express the significant difference that this has made in my life ever since the publication. But beyond that, I recall during the publication process that moment when I began to envision that I not only wanted to create an innovative children's book, but also I wanted to create a product that's going to serve as a platform as well. What do I mean by this? Meaning that when it came out, I wanted it to now have that platform where I could build other things on it. So it came out in May 2021, and by July, we built on this platform what is called the Airport Adventure Book Tasting Community Event. So we did a series of events around the city of Philadelphia where we were engaging people in giving them a taste of the Airport Adventure. Beyond that, now I created what is called a series of thought-provoking trainings. I mean, when you take those trainings, I want you to be in a position where your thoughts are provoked. And why am I saying that? Because sometimes if your thoughts aren't provoked, then you remain in the same place and you do the same thing over and over again. So in those trainings, they're designed to have you go through that thought-provoking process. One of the trainings, actually, this is a part of. It's the Airport Adventure jigsaw puzzle. So it's actually still in its packaging as well, but it's a part of one of the trainings. So with the event, the trainings, and the jigsaw puzzle, I was also able to create what is called the Airport Adventure, the Runway podcast show, which we launched about a month ago. It is quite interesting that during this concept of developing the idea around this, I was like, wow, there's so many podcast shows that's out there, radio shows, or platforms where people are able to go on and have an interview or have a discussion around a topic. What's going to be different about the Airport Adventure, the Runway? So I looked at the regular airport and I said, okay, wow, there's an airport and it has what is called the runway. So this is why the show is called the Runway. On the runway, it allows the plane to go on there and then take off and go to a whole new destination. So I'm like, oh, perfect. That's what we're going to do. If a person comes on the show, then we want them to go to a whole new destination. We don't want them to come on, we're having a discussion or interview, and you're talking about the same old stuff over and over again. We want to give you either some type of insight, wisdom, knowledge, or understanding, or some type of instruction that could actually take your life to a whole new destination. And we thought about that with the concept of a topic as well. As it pertained to the show, we launched a show about, as I said, a month ago, and we've been talking about the topic of bullying, which originally that was not my ideas. One of our friends actually suggested that. So I'm like, all right, good. I recall now having a verse understanding around the context of bullying, where I did theatrical productions, workshops, professional developments for teachers and staff, activities, and we even did a TV show around the context of bullying back then. I recall this. Anything that we were doing and we brought it to the community, it always spark up this conversation where it was like, wow, I never knew these things about the context of bullying. Like, this is the first time we're being aware of it, but it brought our understanding to a whole new destination. So that fit perfect within the concept of saying, hey, let's start the show off with this. So for the past month, we've been talking about the different elements of bullying, hoping we can get people to have a better understanding of what it is and how to deal with it in a de-escalating manner of the issue, right? So what's really interesting about this, right? So, a part of the show, we talk about the history of bullying, which most people don't even know the history of it. The history of it, as in back in the 1800s, right? There was the context that a bully was a friend or a lover, not in today's society as we see it as a negative person or a gangster or this rough or tough person. Back in the 1800s, it was a friend or a lover. Somewhere along the line, it transitioned from someone positive to now in the 21st century, it's someone negative, right? We highlighted that in the context of the show. So last week now, I had a series of what is called small world encounters. So I was with a group of individuals, and we're there and we're talking, and one of the persons actually took her phone and made a FaceTime phone call to someone else. I was in a close proximity of that person. When the person FaceTimed the other person, I was able to see who came on the screen. When I looked, it was a friend that I knew for years. I didn't even know that both of them were good friends. And I'm like, wow, what a small world. So I knew these two individuals for years, but never knew that they knew each other. Small world. Another scenario that happened, just within the past couple of days, we celebrated Thanksgiving. So during that process, there are people who go together with their families, right? So someone shared a picture on Facebook and it came on my timeline. When I looked at one of the family pictures, I saw a friend. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know that you on social media, Facebook, right, is connected to that person that I know in public. And it's so new to the point where I think I'm going to see the person next week. I'm going to like, hey, I didn't know that you and you were connected, or ask if that's your family because I saw the picture on Facebook. So that was my second encounter, right? And then now dealing with the topic of bullying, recalling now, I was sharing this concept around the history of bullying and how it meant this bully was a positive or lover or friend, right? So now last week again, I was on the plane and I was watching this documentary around Obama, his actual progress from being a senator all the way to president. I was watching this the documentary on the plane, and for some reason, when I got off the plane, it just was in the urge of me to continue to watch different documentaries. So when I reached where I was going, I actually started watching a series of documentaries on YouTube. And if you know anything about YouTube, once you watch a video or movie or anything like that on YouTube, then it brings up another one within that same context. So that's what happened now. A series of documentaries that I was watching was actually along the same lines, right? So this one documentary who was featured Jordan Maxwell. Research him. This guy, my goodness, his knowledge, vast knowledge about the history of things, right? So here is it that he's talking on this documentary about the word sin. And he's bringing it to my attention that sin was never something negative as it relates to today. So I'm like, oh, sin, bully? Oh, so that grabbed my attention, right? So I'm watching it now and he's explaining it now where he's breaking it down in terms by terms. And it's like now giving us the reality of what a sin was and how it associated with those back in the ancient days. So he expressed that the word sin was associated with God. So this is how he explained it. There's what is called the moon, and the moon goes through different cycles. The cycles before it comes to what is called the full moon. The first cycle of the moon is called Sin, which is a god that they worship back in the ancient days. He used these two contexts to really break them down, where he's saying that sin, as in the god, was worshipped by those who were in the ancient days under what is called the moon god, right? The moon god was a part of what is called the lunar calendar. So the context of how we have a calendar today and we associate certain things that we do around the calendar days, that's how they did it back in the old days. But those days they worship what is called the lunar god, which the lunar god now, which is the moon, right? The first cycle is called sin. So he's expressing this now in the context of going to the Bible and talking about the story of Moses, saying that Moses was also a worshiper of the sin god, which is why he went to where it's called Mount Sinai to get what is called the Ten Commandments. So he broke down Mount Sinai and saying sin and Ai, which is the words that are put together to call Mount Sinai, right? Sinai. So sin is the God, Ai is the mountain. So he went to the mountain to meet God to get the commandments. So that's one of the things that he used to break it down. And I'm like, wow. Then he went in and he talked about what is called the synagogue. And he's like, yeah, the synagogue back in those days was considered the place where people go and worship God, just as today, right? But the difference is that those which he highlighted in Israel spelled the word synagogue with S-I-N because they realized this was the place of worship where they're worshiping the God, synagogue, right? It sounds similar, right? Synagogue, as in they're worshiping the sin god, right? And that now is why they spelled it with S-I-N and not in this, like of this world. In today's society, some people spell it with S-Y-N. So he highlighted that in Israel, they still spell it with the letter I instead of Y. So when I looked at that, I was like, interesting. Israel. Moses went to Egypt to free the Israelites. And it's so funny that the Israelites were fighting against who? The Ai people. So there was a set of people that was called the Ai, right? And it so happened that there was also a city called Ai. So you had the Ai mountain, the Ai people, and the Ai city, and it made sense in what he was talking about. He didn't mention about the people or the city. He just mentioned about the mountain. But when I understood that now, I'm able to now put them into context with the city and the people. And how that context as well, he mentioned that in Israel, right, it's spelled with S-I-N as in the synagogue. And I'm thinking to myself now, oh, but Moses went to Egypt to free the Israelites. So if it's Israel, then it's the Israelites, right? So that's how we began to actually break that down. And he's breaking it down in a way where I'm starting to understand it. Like, how does these two things connect? Bully and sin. So I'm looking at it back in the 1800s like, hey, the bully was a positive person. Now it's a negative person. And then same thing now, the word sin, which represented God, right, was looked at as far as the God that they worship under the lunar calendar. Somewhere along the line, right, there was a transition from where you no longer worship this the lunar god, right, which is the moon god, right, to now worshiping the sun god, which is called the solar calendar. So now day by day we go and we worship what is called a sun god. And he's breaking this down and saying this is why people go to church on Sunday, because we now worship the sun god, which is a part of the solar calendar, which is the time that we're in. So people no longer map out their schedule around the lunar calendar, which is the context of what is called the lunar god, right? And the lunar god, as in meaning the moon god, right? We're now under the context of where we're worshiping the sun god, as in the solar calendar, right? So all of this he was breaking down, and it makes so much sense. Not only just what he's saying now, I recall this. So a couple years ago, I was a part of a team that we were administering therapeutic interventions for what is called elementary school age children, right? At one point, I started to realize that the interventions that we were administering weren't working. I don't know if it's just me, like really looking at it and saying, hey, I know we're doing this, but it's like the students are not getting better. Um, so at some point, I started to look at it in the context of what is called labeling. I started to see that the label that we gave the student was more impactful than the interventions that we were giving them. And to me, when I started to connect the two, I'm like, no wonder the interventions aren't working. Because you're labeling the students these contexts, and then you're giving them the interventions, but the labeling has such a powerful influence over your life, especially when you mentally start to think that you are what is it that the people are calling you. So that was one thing, right? So I started to reflect that now beyond the job to now in my life. I'm like, listen, from that point, I allowed no one, no matter if we have the same skin color, to call me the N word. Like, you're not going to label me that anymore. So from there, I started to now disassociate myself with anyone who is calling me that name. Like, not getting away from the person, but I'm not answering to that name anymore. And I'm addressing it to the person like, that's not my name. You can call me such and such, but you can't call me the N word, not because we're the same color or whatever. All right. So that was a part of that. Also, I recalled that I started to realize that I was going to church every Sunday and I was being called a sinner. Not me per se, but our congregation. This is what you call the person. And I'm like, week by week, I don't want this label in my life. And literally, I'm like, this was one of the things that caused me to not go to this weekly service anymore, because I was like, I don't want to be labeled that, because I know the impact that it has when you label someone a sinner. But this was based on the context of what I knew it as before, right? But look at this. I recall some point, right? I was researching the word sin because I was like, I just had a feeling that it was being used in the wrong context. Like, and I was researching it, and I couldn't find anything. The closest thing that I came across, which was very interesting now, I came across the word sign, as in sign with dealing with when you're finding the angle of a triangle, like the sine and the cosine, right? So when I looked at that, I was like, oh, that was the closest thing. That didn't make sense to me. But now it does. Like, if I begin to talk to you about it ever since I watched that documentary under the context of Mount Sinai and sign, wow. Now it makes sense. But that was the closest thing that listen, I'm telling you, I recall that. I researched it. I'm like, something doesn't feel right with this word. And I couldn't find anything back then. But as I said, now I'm watching the documentary. It just makes sense. So those were two things that I looked at, right? I walked away from the religious world. And what do you think I did to my job? I walked away from it as well. Because I was like, these labelings that we're giving the individuals, right? It's like it has more influence and more of a stronghold over your life compared to the interventions that we're given. especially when they start to interpret it and saying, this is me, that of which I'm being called, right? Or being labeled. So that was something that was interesting back then. And now it's making so much sense to me now. So, how does this tie into the concept of bullying, right? Because I'm like, somewhere along the line, we were bullied to believe that sin, right, which is the lunar or moon god, right, is what is called something negative and demeaning. Like you don't want to commit a sin. But in the back of my mind now, I'm seeing that somewhere along the line, we were forced in type of a bullying way, like you bully us to now not believe in this system that the Asian people use to now believe in a system where it's the sun god that we're worshiping, which is a part of the solar calendar. That's the difference. One worship the moon and one worship the sun. That's why, as he's explaining, we go to church on what? Sunday. And then when you look at the work days of what we do, we go by the calendar, right? Monday to Friday, that's a part of the calendar. Like that's the solar calendar that we're doing that under. So those were things that I look at. Here's something also that I recall as he was talking about the moon god. I learned in psychology that there's a person that's often called a lunatic. And a lunatic was a person who was having mental challenges with their whether their environment or their circumstance, right? They go off the wall. Lunatic is a part of the lunar, which is the moon, which is why when we have what is called what? A full moon, people go crazy because the moon has some type of influence on our lives. So I could see why they would call this as a god back then. Also, I remember being a teacher as well in the classroom, we were teaching about this story and we were talking about the concept of how the moon has an influence on the water, like the tides of the ocean. So you can see how the moon has such a powerful impact on the land or the water, right? Or who we are. So you could see why these people back in the ancient days would think that the moon would be considered a god because it has such an impact on our life, even up to today. Because you still have, when you go through that full moon process, you still have people who act a certain way. And the same thing, the moon still has impact on the ocean and the tides and stuff like that, right? So these were things that I found so interesting, and I started to look at it. It's like, hey, the concept of bully in the 1800 as a friend or lover, right? Now it's been something that's negative. The same thing with the concept of the word sin, which meant the moon god. Now it's being looked at as the worst thing you ever did, and now you're being called a sinner day by day, and you're taking on that connotation of whatever power that word comes with as far as labeling. And these were things that I learned inside that either mental health or behavior health that I was dealing with as we got professional development training around dealing with our clients as aka the students, right? So even in that field, there were a bunch of things that were being changed because of their labeling. So you couldn't call someone blind anymore. You have to now say visually impaired because they realize the impact when you say, oh, this person is blind. You couldn't call someone a retard anymore. You have to say intellectual disabled, something along that sort. But they were realizing the impact that labeling people, how it influence or control their life, which is why I was looking at it from the therapeutic standpoint that these interventions weren't going to work if especially the person is internalizing it that this is who I am, right? So those were things that I looked at, and they just made sense. So in the context of now being labeled as a sinner, as I said, that didn't work with me anymore. But now that I've watched this documentary last week and I'm starting to understand the concept, I'm like, oh, somewhere along the line, we were bullied from this context of what is called the moon god worshiping, as in the lunar calendar, to now worshiping the sun god under the solar calendar. Why am I mentioning this? Because these are things that we want to bring to the platform of the airport adventure, the runway. We want to give you things that's going to spark some type of provoking of the thought for you to really think about. And when it goes back to, this is why I'm saying I'm super proud of this, because it has been the platform where it allows me to build things like this, and I'm starting to encounter certain things in life that I didn't understand. Like, if I tell you the amount of things I've now become aware of because of the airport, like me studying the airport and dealing with this, it's like I have a whole new life. But this is what it has done for me, and the more I'm aware of certain things, the more I could share. And this is why I created the platform, the airport adventure, the runway, so we can bring either a person or a topic on the platform, and we can go to a whole new destination. Going back to this topic, right? It is not something new. So back in the 1990s, right, we could attribute to say that we knew this inside out, that there were 9 planets. Today, that's a different reality, right? Because they're now like, oh, there's no longer 9 planets, right? Remember, back in the 1990s again, we used to say, in even our textbooks, right, in schools, you would go and you would learn like, this is who discovered America. This is who discovered it. And then today we're like, oh, so you're saying that Christopher Columbus didn't discover this? But these were the things that were taught to us, and it's like these were things that were permanent in our mental capacity. You know how many people died and believed that Christopher Columbus, what? Discovered America or discovered other parts of the world? You know how many people died and believed that there's 9 planets? And the list could go on of all the other things that we have been taught, and they were not the realities. So when I look at this now, it's like, hey, somebody found it fitting, right, to do a documentary around this and found an expert. When you listen to Jordan Maxwell and you listen to how he's breaking things down, like, this guy is well versed. But for me, even though he's well versed in these things, like if I could attribute it to different things in my life, that would have been a good documentary, and I understood it, and I would move on. The reason why I'm bringing this, because I saw it in my life as well, pertaining to the topic that we're dealing with, right? Pertaining to the swastika sign, right? Even in the athletic, I grew up playing football. In Jamaica and other parts of the world, it's called football. When you come over here, it's called football from a different context, right? But now it's also called soccer. So you see how one thing could move from one place and come over to another place and call something different and looked at as something different, because football over here is where you run with your hands and you hold the ball. Football in the rest of the world is where you kick the ball with your foot. So if you never been to anywhere else in the world I even know of what is called football, on the other hand, you would just think that football is just this running sport where you run with the ball in your hand. Because over here they call it soccer. So these are things that I've seen, and I just wanted to bring them to your attention. Hopefully they have made some type of provoking through your thought. That's all. Because if your thoughts are not provoked, then you're going to stay in the same position over and over again and do the same thing over and over again for the rest of your life. Which for me, this is why we created the runway. where we can bring a person or a topic online, right, and have a discussion and go to a whole new destination. So that's it for me. All I want to say is be safe, stay healthy, and build new possibilities. I want to show you something before I exit. Hopefully you can see it. It says live safely, right? I could tell you this. Doctors, therapists, psychologists, counselors, neurologists, who else? Psychiatrists, did I mention that? All of them have to go to this destination if they're dealing with you as a client. All of them. That should be the outcome of everyone that's dealing with you as a client. For you to live safely with everything around you and everyone. Why? Because the moment you're unsafe is when you have a mental issue. And that's a part of the body mechanics. So when I say the airport adventure, live safely, I'm not just saying something because I made it up. Every one of those professions that I just highlighted, that has to be their final outcome if they want you to be better. The moment you're unsafe, right, everything tears apart. The moment you live safely, then everything works together, and everything, you'll see how it's a small world because everything is interconnected. All right? God bless.